The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the country club's service corridor. Crystal fragments scattered like tiny accusations across the pristine white tiles. I stared down at the mess, my hands trembling despite 3 years of steady catering work that had calloused my palms and strengthened my grip. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Martinez! What the hell was that? Chef Bradley's voice cut through the pre-wedding chaos from the kitchen doorway. His face was flushed red from the heat and stress of preparing for 200 guests. Sorry, chef, I'll clean it up. My voice came out steady, professional. I'd learned to keep my tone neutral, unremarkable. It was safer that way. He shook his head and disappeared back into the kitchen, muttering about amateur help. I knelt carefully, gathering the larger pieces first, methodical in my movements. Muscle memory from a different life kicked in. Always secure the perimeter first, then work inward. Some habits die harder than others. The country club buzzed with the expensive energy that only comes with society weddings. Towering floral arrangements perfumed the air with gardenias and white roses. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across cream-colored walls, adorned with portraits of long-dead benefactors. Everything gleamed with the kind of polish that money could buy, and most people could only dream of touching. I was invisible here, just another uniformed server in black slacks and a crisp white shirt, hair pulled back in the regulation bun required by prestige catering services. The other servers barely looked at me. To them, I was Sarah Martinez, the quiet one who never complained about overtime, never called in sick, never caused drama. The one who could carry more plates than anyone else and navigate crowded rooms like I was dancing through a minefield. Which, technically, I had been. More than once. The bride was Melissa Chen, daughter of pharmaceutical executive Robert Chen. The groom was my brother David Hartwell, soon to be vice president of marketing at Chen Industries. Though he didn't know it yet, that promotion would be Daddy Chen's wedding gift, along with the down payment on a house in Westchester County that cost more than most people made in a decade. I'd learned all this from gossip in the break room, not from family updates. The Hartwells didn't exactly keep me in the loop anymore. Through the service window, I caught glimpses of the cocktail hour in full swing. Women in designer dresses that cost more than I made in 6 months, mingled with men whose watches could fund small countries. The conversation floated on practiced laughter and the kind of small talk that revealed nothing and meant even less. David moved through the crowd like he belonged there, which I supposed he did now. At 28, he'd grown into his jawline and learned to wear expensive suits like armor. His smile was camera-ready, his handshake confident. He'd always been the golden child, but now he'd polished himself to a mirror shine. Our mother, Patricia Hartwell, stood near the bar in a navy dress that probably came from Bergdorf's. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her posture perfect. She laughed at something the pharmaceutical executive's wife said, the sound carrying across the room like wind chimes. Refined. Controlled. Everything she'd tried to make me before she gave up. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not since the funeral that wasn't really a funeral, where they'd buried an empty casket and she'd stood dry-eyed beside a folded flag. The flag had been crisp, ceremonial, exactly the kind of prop the military used when they needed to close a difficult chapter with dignity intact. My father hadn't lived to see that day. Robert Hartwell had died of a heart attack my 2nd year overseas, and I'd gotten the news through official channels rather than a phone call. By the time I made it home for his funeral, the family had already started rewriting history. David was the responsible son staying close to home. I was the reckless daughter who'd chosen duty over family, who'd abandoned them for foreign wars they couldn't understand. The truth was more complicated, but truth rarely survived contact with the Hartwell family narrative. Table assignments, people. Chef Bradley clapped his hands, snapping me back to the present. Chen Hartwell wedding is a go time in 30 minutes. Martinez, you're on the head table. Perfect. Close enough to watch David's perfect day unfold. Invisible enough that none of them would recognize the sister who'd supposedly died in a convoy bombing outside Kandahar 18 months ago. The sister whose memorial service they'd held without bothering to wait for confirmation. The sister whose bank accounts they'd closed, and whose apartment they'd cleaned out with impressive efficiency. Sarah Martinez had been born in that Kabul military hospital, where they'd listed Colonel Diana Hartwell as killed in action due to a clerical error that took 6 months to correct. By the time the Army figured out I was alive, recovering from injuries in a classified medical facility, my family had already moved on. The insurance money had been processed. The grief had been publicly displayed and privately buried. When I'd finally made it stateside, damaged but breathing, I discovered that being legally dead was surprisingly liberating. No expectations. No disappointed phone calls. No pressure to be the daughter they'd wanted instead of the soldier I'd become. Sarah Martinez didn't have a Distinguished Service Cross gathering dust in a closet. She didn't wake up some nights with the taste of sand and blood in her mouth. She didn't carry the weight of decisions that had saved dozens of lives but cost her everything else. Sarah Martinez just served champagne and cleaned up messes and collected paychecks that kept her in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town. It wasn't much of a life, but it was quiet. It was safe. I adjusted my name tag and checked my reflection in the polished silver serving tray. The scar along my left temple had faded to a thin white line, easily covered by carefully styled bangs. The surgical pins in my shoulder didn't show through the uniform shirt. 3 years of physical therapy had taught me to move without favoring my left leg. To anyone looking, I was just another working-class woman grateful for steady employment at a fancy venue. Someone who knew her place and kept to it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 2 tours leading reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, making split-second decisions that determined whether my team came home alive. I'd coordinated airstrikes and negotiated with tribal leaders and written reports that landed on generals' desks. I'd been trusted with classified intelligence that could shift the balance of entire regions. Now I was polishing water glasses and trying not to drop the silverware. But as I straightened my shoulders and prepared to walk into that glittering ballroom where my brother was about to marry into money and respectability, I reminded myself that survival takes many forms. Sometimes courage looks like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like showing up to serve drinks at a wedding where everyone believes you're dead. Tonight, I was going to find out which version of courage I had left in me. The head table gleamed under the chandelier's light, set with china so delicate it seemed to whisper threats about replacement costs. I began arranging the final touches, each movement precise and practiced. Just another invisible server, making sure everything was perfect for the bride and groom's special day. I had no idea that in less than 2 hours, everything I'd carefully built would come crashing down with 2 words from a man I'd hoped never to see again. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been restocking napkin dispensers in the break room when I overheard Kelly Martinez, no relation despite sharing my stolen surname, gossiping with another server about the upcoming Chen Hartwell wedding. The name had hit me like a sniper's bullet, sudden and precisely aimed. "Biggest event of the spring season," Kelly had said, thumbing through her phone. 200 guests, open bar, 5-course dinner. Chef Bradley's been stress-eating antacids for a week. She'd paused, scrolling through what looked like social media photos. The groom's family is Old Money, Connecticut. The bride's father owns half the pharmaceutical companies on the East Coast. I'd kept my head down, focusing on the mundane task of counting paper products, but my hands had started shaking. David. My little brother David, who used to build elaborate Lego fortresses and make me promise to bring him back something cool from every deployment. David, who'd cried when I left for my first tour and made me swear I'd come home safe. David, who'd given the eulogy at my memorial service without waiting to see if there was actually a body to bury. The venue's gorgeous, Kelly had continued, oblivious to the emotional grenade she'd just lobbed into my carefully constructed life. Westchester Country Club. You know, the one with the golf course that hosts those charity tournaments. My cousin, who worked at an event there last year, said the tips were insane. That's when I'd made the mistake of looking up. Kelly's phone screen showed a professional engagement photo. David in a charcoal suit, arm around a petite Asian woman with perfect teeth and a diamond that could blind pilots. They were both laughing at something off camera, looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful young couples. But it was the background of the photo that had stopped my heart. The terrace of the Westchester Country Club, with its distinctive stone balustrade and manicured gardens stretching toward the Sound. I'd been to exactly 3 events at that club in my entire life: my high school graduation party, my college graduation dinner, and my commissioning ceremony celebration. All hosted by my parents, back when they were still proud to introduce me as their daughter. Earth to Sarah, Kelly had laughed. You look like you've seen a ghost. If only she knew. That night, I'd done something I hadn't done in 3 years. I'd Googled my own family. The wedding announcement in the Westchester County Journal-News had been sickeningly perfect. David Alexander Hartwell, son of the late Robert Hartwell and Patricia Hartwell of Greenwich, to marry Melissa Rose Chen, daughter of Dr. Robert Chen and Mrs. Linda Chen of Scarsdale. The groom was described as a rising marketing executive at Chen Industries. The bride was a pediatric resident at Mount Sinai. No mention of a deceased sister. No memorial line about a daughter who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. It was as if I'd never existed at all. The photo gallery had been worse. David and Melissa at charity galas, at company retreats, at family dinners. My mother in designer clothes, looking 20 years younger than she had at Dad's funeral. There were pictures of the engagement party, held at some trendy Manhattan restaurant, with familiar faces from my childhood making toasts and celebration. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Not one empty chair. Not one moment of silence. Not one acknowledgement that their family had once included another child. I'd close the laptop and walk to my kitchen, where I kept a bottle of bourbon for the nights when sleep seemed impossible. 3 fingers neat, knocked back like medicine. Then I'd sat on my fire escape, looking out at the city lights and trying to decide if I was more angry or relieved. The truth was, I'd had opportunities to reach out. 3 years was a long time to stay dead by choice. I could have walked up to my mother's front door any Tuesday afternoon and watched her world implode. I could have called David's office and asked for a meeting that would have required sedatives. But every time I'd gotten close, I'd remembered the conversation I'd overheard at Dad's funeral. Patricia Hartwell speaking quietly to her sister Margaret in the church hallway, thinking no one was listening. Diana always was too much, she'd said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Too loud, too stubborn, too willing to fight about everything. I just pray David doesn't follow her example. She was serving her country, Aunt Margaret had replied, but without much conviction. She was running away from responsibility, my mother had corrected. She could have used her degree for something respectable. Law school, business school, medicine like Robert wanted. Instead, she chose to play a soldier in countries that don't even want us there. The words had carved themselves into my memory with surgical precision. Not grief, judgment. Not loss. Relief. So when I died 18 months later, officially and paperwork-wise, I'd let them mourn the daughter they'd invented, rather than the one they'd actually raised. The brave patriot. The noble sacrifice. The convenient narrative that let them feel proud instead of disappointed. Sarah Martinez was born from that conversation. A woman who kept her head down and her expectations low. A woman who didn't challenge anyone, or cause problems, or make demands. A woman who understood her place in the world and stayed there quietly. But now, standing in that break room with Kelly's wedding gossip echoing in my ears, I'd realized that David's wedding wasn't just another high-end catering gig. It was a test. Could I serve champagne to the people who'd buried me without bothering to check if I was actually dead? Could I watch my baby brother dance with his new wife while our mother beamed in the background, finally having the perfect family she'd always wanted? Could I be invisible in the same room where I'd once belonged? I'd spent 3 years learning to be Sarah Martinez. 3 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. 3 years convincing myself that I'd chosen this life, that it was freedom rather than exile. But as I'd watched Kelly swipe through more engagement photos, something had shifted inside me. A door I'd thought was permanently sealed had cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Or maybe it was rage. Sometimes the two felt remarkably similar. I could get you on the event staff, Kelly had offered, mistaking my silence for interest. Chef Bradley likes you, and they always need extra servers for the big weddings. The overtime pay alone would cover your rent for the month. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Kelly had taken that as enthusiasm and immediately started texting someone about shift assignments. Within 10 minutes, she'd secured me a spot on the Westchester Country Club catering team for the Chen Hartwell wedding. That night, I'd pulled out the small metal box I kept hidden behind my winter coats. Inside were the few things I'd salvaged from my old life. My father's watch, my college graduation photo, a letter David had written me during my first deployment. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of silk, my Distinguished Service Cross. I'd held the medal for a long time, feeling its weight, remembering the ceremony where they'd pinned it to my uniform. The citation had read, "For extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States." What it hadn't mentioned was that the enemy had been closer to home than anyone realized. The next morning, I called Prestige Catering and accepted the assignment. 3 weeks later, here I was, straightening my uniform and preparing to walk into a ballroom full of people who thought I was safely buried in Arlington National Cemetery. People who'd moved on without me so completely that my absence had become just another family story to avoid at dinner parties. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Closure, maybe. Or revenge. Or maybe just the satisfaction of knowing I could survive seeing them again without falling apart. What I hadn't expected was that someone in that ballroom might recognize me. Someone who knew exactly who Colonel Diana Hartwell had been, and what she'd done to earn that medal hidden in my closet. Someone who'd believed I was dead and would have very specific questions about why I wasn't. The ballroom doors opened at exactly 6:30, and the guests flowed in like a river of silk and success. I positioned myself behind the champagne station, silver tray balanced perfectly in my left hand, right hand ready to serve. 3 years of muscle memory kicked in as I scanned the room with tactical precision, exits, crowd flow patterns, potential choke points. Old habits. The first wave consisted mostly of Melissa's medical school friends and hospital colleagues, young professionals in their late 20s and early 30s, the kind of people who discussed wine pairings and vacation homes in the Hamptons with casual authority. They moved past me without a glance, their conversations flowing around pharmaceutical conferences and residency rotations. Then came David's college fraternity brothers, now transformed into investment bankers and corporate lawyers. I recognized some faces from old Facebook photos I'd stalked years ago, but they'd all filled out their expensive suits and learned to project the kind of confidence that comes with healthy portfolios and clear career trajectories. "Sarah, more champagne to table 7, Chef Bradley's voice crackled through my earpiece. "And make sure you smile. These people tip based on service attitude." I nodded and moved through the crowd, offering drinks with the kind of professional invisibility I'd perfected. A slight smile, eye contact, just long enough to be polite, voice pitched to blend into background noise. The guests accepted champagne flutes without really seeing me, their attention focused on more important conversations about market volatility and private school admissions. At table 7, I recognized Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, my mother's longtime friend and tennis partner. She was holding court with several other women, all of them dripping with jewelry that could fund small nations. Her laugh was the same artificially musical sound I remembered from childhood dinner parties, when she'd pat my head and ask if I was being a good little soldier. "The flowers are absolutely divine," she was saying as I approached the champagne tray. "Patricia must have spent a fortune on those centerpieces. Though I suppose she can afford it now that she only has one child to worry about." Quote, the words hit like shrapnel, but I kept my expression neutral as I offered champagne to the table. Dr. Morrison took a flute without looking at me, her attention focused on the woman beside her. "Such a tragedy about Diana," the other woman murmured. Though Patricia handled it beautifully, the memorial service was so moving. "A mother's strength," Dr. Morrison agreed, raising her glass. "She's thrown herself into charity work since then, the Gold Star Mothers organization, you know, very therapeutic." Gold Star Mothers, the organization for women who'd lost children in military service. My mother had joined a club for grieving military mothers while I was alive, and serving drinks 20 feet away from her tennis partner. I finished serving table 7 and moved toward the head table, where David and Melissa would be seated with both sets of parents. The table was positioned on a slight elevation, giving the wedding party a clear view of the entire ballroom. More importantly, it gave the entire ballroom a clear view of them. As I arranged the final place settings, I caught sight of my mother near the bar. Patricia Hartwell had aged gracefully, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob that probably required weekly maintenance. She wore a navy blue dress that screamed designer label, complemented by pearls that had been my grandmother's. Her posture was perfect, her makeup flawless, her smile practiced to camera-ready precision. She was speaking with Dr. Robert Chen, Melissa's father, their conversation punctuated by the kind of knowing nods that suggested business relationships extending far beyond wedding planning. Chen Industries and Hartwell Consulting had apparently found common ground that went deeper than their children's romance. The merger talks are proceeding ahead of schedule, I heard Dr. Chen say as I pretended to adjust water glasses nearby. David's market analysis was particularly insightful. You raised a sharp boy, Patricia. He gets his business sense from his father, my mother replied, her voice carrying that warm pride I remembered from David's high school graduation. Robert always said David had the instincts for corporate strategy, much more practical than his sister ever was. Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. Military service is noble, of course, but it's not exactly preparation for the business world. David made the right choice staying stateside. I'd been accepted to Harvard Business School. The letter had arrived 3 days before I'd committed to my second tour in Afghanistan. I'd never told them about the acceptance, never mentioned the scholarship offer, never explained that I'd chosen military service over an MBA because I'd believed in something larger than profit margins. But apparently that detail hadn't made it into the family mythology. A commotion near the entrance announced David's arrival. He swept into the ballroom with Melissa on his arm, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing everything in your life is proceeding exactly according to plan. David had always been handsome, but success had given him a confidence that transformed his entire presence. The crowd parted naturally as the couple made their way toward the head table. Guests approached with congratulations and air kisses, their voices carrying the practiced warmth of professional networking disguised as personal affection. David! A booming voice cut through the chatter. Marcus Webb, David's college roommate, now apparently a partner at some prestigious law firm. Looking good, brother. Marriage suits you already. David grinned and accepted a backslapping hug. Thanks for flying in from Chicago, Marcus. Melissa, you remember Marcus from graduation. Of course, Melissa smiled, extending her hand with practiced grace. David told me so many stories about your college adventures, though I'm sure most of them are highly exaggerated. More laughter, more congratulations, more casual mentions of career achievements and social connections. I moved through the periphery of these conversations, refilling water glasses and replacing used napkins, absorbing fragments of my brother's new life. He was vice president of marketing now, though the official announcement wouldn't come until Monday. The promotion came with a corner office and equity options that would make him independently wealthy by 35. Melissa's residency was nearly complete, and she'd already been offered a position at one of Manhattan's most exclusive pediatric practices. They were building the kind of life our parents had always dreamed of. Successful, respectable, socially connected. The kind of life they'd hoped I might choose, instead of running off to play soldier in foreign countries that didn't appreciate American intervention. As the evening progressed, I began to notice the conversations that stopped when I approached tables. The way certain guests would glance at my name tag and then away, as if trying to place something they couldn't quite identify. The way my mother's friends would pause mid-sentence when I came within earshot, resuming their discussions only after I'd moved on. At table 12, I overheard Colonel James Fletcher, retired now, apparently working as a defense contractor, speaking quietly with another man about recent developments in military strategy. Fletcher had been Dad's commanding officer during his brief stint in the reserves, decades before I had been born. The insurgency tactics have evolved significantly, Fletcher was saying. We lost some good people over there, especially in the intelligence operations. That Hartwell girl, for instance. Brilliant strategist from what I heard. Real shame about what happened. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for an empty appetizer plate. Fletcher continued, oblivious to my presence. Patricia doesn't talk about it much, understandably, but from what I gathered, Diana was involved in some classified reconnaissance work, the kind of missions that don't make it into official reports. The other man nodded solemnly. These Gold Star families carry such a burden. At least Patricia has David to be proud of. I finished clearing table 12 and headed back toward the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Fletcher knew more about my actual service record than my own mother did. He understood that Colonel Diana Hartwell hadn't just been another casualty of war, she'd been leading operations that mattered. But none of that information had apparently made it into the family's version of events. As the dinner service began, I realized that tonight wasn't just about serving champagne to people who thought I was dead. It was about discovering how thoroughly they'd rewritten history to exclude me from it. The question was, what would happen when someone in this room recognized that history wasn't quite as buried as they'd believed? The moment came during the toasts, when the champagne had loosened tongues and the success of the evening had made everyone bold. I was stationed near the kitchen doors, holding a tray of fresh champagne flutes for any guests who needed refills during the speeches. The ballroom had settled into that warm, expectant hush that comes before family members stand up to embarrass themselves with heartfelt declarations. David rose first, microphone in hand, looking every inch the successful executive in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. The room quieted completely, all attention focused on the golden couple at the head table. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "Melissa and I are overwhelmed by the love and support you've shown us." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the little brother who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms. The bone structure was the same, but everything else had been polished to corporate perfection. "I have to thank my beautiful bride for making me the luckiest man alive," David continued, reaching for Melissa's hand. "And I want to thank Dr. and Mrs. Chen for welcoming me into their family so graciously." More applause. Melissa beamed up at him with practiced adoration. "I also want to thank my mother, Patricia Hartwell, for everything she sacrificed to get us to this moment." David's voice took on a more serious tone. "Mom, you've been both mother and father to me since Dad died. You've shown me what strength looks like, especially during the darkest times." The camera phones came out as guests prepared to capture the emotional moment. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing her role to perfection. "Some of you know that our family faced tremendous loss when my sister Diana was killed in Afghanistan," David said, his voice growing heavy with practiced grief. "She died serving her country, but she also died serving her own ego." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the champagne tray tighter, my knuckles white against the silver. "Diana always had to be the hero of every story," David continued, his tone shifting from grief to something harder. "She couldn't just serve quietly like other soldiers. She had to volunteer for the most dangerous missions, had to prove she was tougher than everyone else. In the end, her need to be special got her killed and nearly destroyed our family." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, but others nodded in recognition of a family dynamic they'd apparently witnessed. "Mom had to plan a funeral for a daughter who died because she couldn't follow orders," David said, his voice gaining strength. "She had to accept a folded flag for a child who chose war over family. And through it all, she never said a word against Diana's memory. That's the kind of grace I hope to bring to my marriage." The applause was more subdued now, uncertain. But David wasn't finished. "Tonight, as I start my new family with Melissa, I want to acknowledge the people who actually showed up, the people who stayed, the people who chose responsibility over glory." He raised his champagne flute. "To those who serve quietly, who build instead of destroy, who choose love over whatever it was my sister thought she was fighting for." The toast echoed across the ballroom, and I watched 200 people raise their glasses in honor of my erasure. Not just my death, my complete moral failure as a human being. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the tray. A champagne flute slipped, but I caught it before it could shatter against the floor. The movement drew attention from nearby guests, and I forced myself to look down, to blend back into invisibility. But the damage was done. The words were out there, hanging in the air like poison gas. Patricia rose next, accepting the microphone from David with trembling hands. Her performance would be flawless, I knew. She'd spent 3 years perfecting it. "My son is too kind," she began, her voice breaking just enough to sound authentic. "Diana was complicated. She was brilliant, but she was also stubborn. She wanted to save the world, but she couldn't save herself. More murmurs of sympathy from the crowd. Someone near table 6 wiped away tears. The army told us she died trying to rescue wounded soldiers from an ambush, Patricia continued. But they also told us she disobeyed direct orders to stay with her convoy. She went off on her own, like she always did, like she always had to do. I could feel blood rushing in my ears. The official report had been classified, but somehow my mother had created her own version of events. A version where I was a reckless glory seeker who'd gotten myself killed through arrogance and insubordination. I've learned to forgive her, Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. I've learned to remember the good times instead of dwelling on how she left us. But I won't pretend her choices didn't have consequences. David has spent years cleaning up the mess she left behind. She looked directly at David, her eyes shining with maternal pride. My son chose to honor his family instead of abandoning it. He chose to build a legacy instead of chasing shadows in foreign countries. That's why tonight means so much to me. The applause was thunderous this time. Guests wiped away tears and nodded in recognition of a mother's graceful strength in the face of unthinkable loss. I stood frozen behind my champagne tray, listening to my own mother describe me as a selfish child who destroyed the family through reckless heroics. Listening to my brother characterize my military service as ego-driven theater that had nearly cost them everything. The truth was so much more complicated. The convoy mission had been volunteer, only because intelligence suggested a high probability of ambush. I'd gone because I was the most experienced officer available, because I'd run similar operations successfully before, because someone had to make the call that might save lives. The ambush had been worse than expected. We'd lost 2 vehicles and taken casualties, but my team had extracted 13 wounded soldiers under heavy fire. The Bronze Star citation had called it extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. But none of that had made it into the family narrative. Instead, I'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition, a daughter who'd chosen military service over marriage and motherhood, who'd paid the ultimate price for refusing to stay in her proper place. To Diana's memory, Patricia concluded, raising her champagne flute, may we learn from her mistakes and choose better paths. The ballroom erupted in applause again. Guests rose to their feet, toasting my failure as a daughter, a sister, a human being. That's when I saw him. Standing near the back of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a pillar, was a man in an expensive navy suit who hadn't applauded, hadn't raised his glass, hadn't joined the standing ovation for my mother's graceful forgiveness. He was staring directly at me with the kind of recognition that made my blood freeze. Victor Castellanos, CEO of Titan Defense Solutions, one of the largest military contracting firms in the world, former Army intelligence colonel, and the man who'd personally signed off on my most classified operations in Afghanistan. Our eyes met across the ballroom, and I watched his face cycle through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. He took a step toward me, moving with the same purposeful stride I remembered from briefing rooms in Kandahar. Other guests blocked his path momentarily, still caught up in the emotion of the toasts, but his focus never wavered. I had exactly 30 seconds before Victor Castellanos reached me and asked the question that would destroy everything. 30 seconds to decide whether Sarah Martinez would disappear forever, or whether Colonel Diana Hartwell would finally rise from the dead. He was 10 feet away when he opened his mouth and said the words that changed everything. "Colonel, you're alive!" The champagne tray slipped from my hands and crashed to the marble floor. Crystal exploded in every direction, the sound cutting through conversations like gunfire. Guests turned to stare at the clumsy server, who'd just destroyed several $100s worth of stemware. But Victor Castellanos wasn't looking at the broken glass. He was looking at me with the intensity of a man who'd just seen the impossible made manifest. "Colonel Diana Hartwell," he said again, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Jesus Christ, they told me you were dead." The ballroom held its breath. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the orchestra stopped playing, their instruments trailing off into confused quiet. I could have run, should have run. The kitchen doors were 15 feet away, and I knew every exit in the building. Sarah Martinez could have disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and questions no one would bother to answer. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and met Victor's stare head-on. "Evening, sir," I said, my voice carrying the crisp authority I'd learned to project in briefing rooms and under enemy fire. I go by Sarah Martinez now. Victor's eyes widened. He'd heard that tone before, in classified meetings where my word had carried the weight of life and death decisions. He knew exactly who he was talking to. Martinez, he repeated slowly, testing the name. Then louder, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. The crowd turned toward him, with the confused obedience people show when someone important demands their focus. Victor Castellanos commanded rooms like he'd once commanded battalions, with absolute certainty that he would be obeyed. I'm Victor Castellanos, CEO of Titan Defense Solutions, he announced, his voice projecting to the back of the ballroom. Some of you may know my company's work with the Department of Defense. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several guests nodded in recognition. Titan Defense was a major player in military contracting, the kind of company that appeared in congressional hearings and Wall Street Journal profiles. 3 years ago, I had the privilege of working with one of the most exceptional officers I've ever encountered, Victor continued, his eyes never leaving my face. Colonel Diana Hartwell led some of the most successful intelligence operations in the Afghanistan theater. Her work saved hundreds of American lives. The murmuring grew louder. Guests began looking around, trying to understand why the CEO of a major defense contractor was giving an impromptu military history lesson at a wedding. Colonel Hartwell was reported killed in action 18 months ago, Victor said, his voice growing stronger. Her convoy was ambushed while conducting a classified rescue operation. We held a memorial service at the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense personally presented her posthumous decorations to her family. I watched the color drain from Patricia's face. David had gone completely still, his champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips. Imagine my surprise, Victor continued, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, to discover that Colonel Hartwell is very much alive and apparently working as catering staff at this lovely event. The ballroom erupted. Guests turned to stare at me with new eyes, their previous invisibility replaced by laser focus. Camera phones appeared, recording what was clearly about to become a very memorable wedding story. Patricia recovered first, rising from her chair with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to managing social crises. Mr. Castellanos, she said, her voice pitched to carry authority and confusion in equal measure, I'm afraid there's been some mistake. My daughter Diana died in Afghanistan. We held her memorial service. The army presented us with her flag. Victor's smile didn't waver. Mrs. Hartwell, with all due respect, the army makes mistakes. But I don't. He turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. Colonel, would you mind removing that name tag? I reached up and unpinned the Sarah Martinez badge from my uniform shirt. The small piece of plastic and metal felt heavier than my medal citations, as I held it in my palm. Diana Hartwell, Victor announced to the room, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism during Operation Vanguard Shield. She personally led the extraction of 13 wounded soldiers from a Taliban ambush, conducting the rescue under heavy fire while suffering significant injuries herself. The silence was complete now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place by the electric tension filling the room. The mission was classified, Victor continued, which is why the details never made it into public reports. What the public did know was that Colonel Hartwell was one of the most decorated female officers of her generation, a strategic intelligence specialist who'd been fast-tracked for promotion to brigadier general. David finally found his voice. That's impossible, he said, though the words came out strangled. Diana was reckless. She disobeyed orders. She got herself killed because she couldn't follow protocol. Victor turned to look at David with the kind of cold assessment reserved for enemy combatants. Son, your sister never disobeyed an order in her life. She volunteered for the convoy mission because she was the most qualified officer available. The ambush was worse than intelligence predicted, but her team extracted every wounded soldier and brought them home alive. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the killing blow. The only protocol Diana violated was surviving when everyone expected her to die. Melissa had covered her mouth with both hands, staring at me like I was a ghost materializing at her wedding reception. Other guests were openly gaping, their carefully constructed social masks slipping in the face of raw truth. but it was my mother's reaction that cut deepest. Patricia Hartwell looked at me with something that might have been recognition, followed immediately by calculation. Not joy at discovering her daughter was alive. Not relief that the grief had been unnecessary. Strategy. Damage control. The same expression she'd worn when the neighbors asked too many questions about my military service, or when David's college friends wondered why his sister never came to family events. "Diana," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "is it really you?" I met her eyes across the ballroom, seeing my own face reflected in features I'd inherited. The same strong jaw, the same stubborn chin, the same eyes that had always seen too much and forgiven too little. "Hello, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silence. Surprise. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, 200 wedding guests waited to see what would happen when a dead daughter returned to confront the family that had buried her. Colonel James Fletcher rose slowly from his seat at table 12, his movements deliberate and formal. He'd served long enough to recognize a moment that demanded military protocol. "Colonel Hartwell," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Then he did something that made the entire ballroom gasp. He saluted. It was sharp, crisp, and absolutely correct according to military regulations. A retired colonel showing proper respect to a superior officer who'd earned her rank through blood and sacrifice. The salute hung there for 3 heartbeats before I returned it, my own hand rising to my temple with muscle memory that 3 years of catering work hadn't erased. "Colonel Fletcher," I acknowledged, my voice steady as granite. That's when David's carefully constructed world began to collapse in earnest. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising toward panic. "She's been dead for 18 months. We buried her. We grieved for her. We moved on." I looked at my little brother, really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. The successful executive, the perfect son, the golden child who'd cleaned up all the messes I'd supposedly left behind. "No, David," I said quietly. "You buried Sarah Martinez tonight. Diana Hartwell just came home." The hotel conference room felt smaller at midnight than it had during the afternoon corporate events I'd served there as Sarah Martinez. Now, with camera lights and reporters crowding every available space, it seemed to shrink around me like a tactical situation gone sideways. I sat behind a simple table, still wearing my catering uniform, though I'd removed the apron and rolled up my sleeves. The questions came fast and overlapping, a barrage I navigated with the same calm precision I'd once used to coordinate airstrikes. "Colonel Hartwell, can you explain how you've been legally dead for 18 months while working in civilian employment? Ma'am, what was your family's reaction when they discovered you were alive? Colonel, are there other military personnel listed as KIA who are actually alive?" I raised my hand and the room quieted with surprising speed. 3 years of invisible servitude had ended, but 15 years of command authority remained intact. "Let me be clear about what happened tonight," I began, my voice carrying the measured cadence I'd learned in Pentagon briefings. "My family held a memorial service for me without waiting for official confirmation of death. That's their choice to make. What concerns me more is the systematic rewriting of my military record that followed." A reporter from the Washington Post leaned forward. "Can you elaborate on that, Colonel?" "Tonight, at my brother's wedding, I listened to my mother and brother describe my military service as reckless grandstanding that got me killed through insubordination." I paused, letting that settle. "The truth is that I volunteered for dangerous missions because I was qualified to lead them. My final operation saved 13 soldiers' lives." "What about your family's claim that you disobeyed orders?" This from a local news anchor who'd clearly done her homework. "I have never disobeyed a lawful military order in my career," I said, each word precise as a rifle shot. "That's not my opinion. That's documented fact in my service record, which Mr. Castellanos can verify." Victor nodded from his position near the back of the room. He'd changed from his wedding attire into a business suit, transforming back into the defense contractor who testified before Congress and negotiated billion-dollar military contracts. "The issue isn't my service record," I continued. The issue is what happens to military families when grief becomes more comfortable than truth. When supporting the troops becomes easier than supporting the individual soldier. My phone had been buzzing constantly since Victor's revelation at the wedding. Text messages, missed calls, social media notifications from accounts I'd thought were safely buried. But 3 messages had cut through the noise, like signal flares. The first was from my former commanding officer, General Patricia Morrison. Diana, thank God. We need to talk immediately. The second was from a journalist at Military Times. Colonel, I've been investigating discrepancies in casualty reports. Your case isn't isolated. The third was from someone I'd never expected to hear from again. Colonel Hartwell, this is Sergeant Maria Santos, 3rd Battalion. I served under your command in Afghanistan. Seeing the news tonight, I thought you should know you saved my life too. There are others who remember. That last message had made the decision for me. I'm announcing the formation of the Clear Record Initiative, I said, looking directly into the cameras. Too many military families are living with incomplete information about their loved one's service. Too many veterans are watching their records get distorted by grief, politics, or simple bureaucratic error. I stood, and the room's energy shifted with me. For the first time in 3 years, I moved with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. This isn't about my family, I continued. This isn't about revenge or vindication. This is about accuracy. When we distort military service records, we dishonor everyone who wears the uniform. Colonel, what about your mother's involvement with Gold Star Mothers? The question came from a reporter in the second row. She's been a prominent advocate for military families. The question hit harder than I'd expected. Patricia's advocacy work, her charity involvement, her public face of graceful grief, all of it built on a foundation of my supposed death. My mother processed grief in the way that worked for her, I said carefully. But advocacy built on false premises helps no one. The Gold Star Mothers organization serves families who've made real sacrifices. They deserve better than to have their ranks filled by people who simply chose to stop waiting for confirmation. What's your next step, Colonel? I looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from skeptical to sympathetic to openly curious. 3 hours ago, these people had never heard of Diana Hartwell. Now they were documenting her return from the dead. I'm returning to active duty, I announced, the words surprising even me as they came out. The Army has offered to reinstate my commission immediately. Apparently, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. I'll be working with the Pentagon to establish protocols for family notification and casualty confirmation. We're going to make sure no other family goes through what mine did in either direction. Colonel, have you spoken with your family since the wedding? The question I'd been dreading. My brother and mother left the wedding reception shortly after Mr. Castellanos' announcement, I said. We haven't spoken directly. What I didn't say was that David had tried to corner me in the hotel lobby, demanding to know why I'd let them suffer for 18 months. Or that Patricia had approached me near the ballroom exit with tears in her eyes, asking if we could work something out privately before the media got involved. I'd told them both the same thing. Truth doesn't negotiate. Colonel, what message do you have for other military families dealing with uncertainty about their loved ones? I thought about Sergeant Santos's message, about the other soldiers who'd served under my command, about the families who were living with real loss while mine had been grieving a fiction. Keep asking questions, I said. Demand proof. Don't let anyone, not the military, not your family, not your community, tell you to accept incomplete answers about someone you love. And if you're a veteran whose service record has been distorted, don't stay silent. Your truth matters. The press conference continued for another hour, but the essential message was already out there. Colonel Diana Hartwell was alive, active, and done hiding behind other people's comfort with her absence. As the reporters filed out and the camera crews packed their equipment, Victor approached the table where I sat reviewing notes on my phone. Hell of a thing, Diana, he said, settling into the chair across from me. You realize this is going to change everything. Good, I replied without looking up. Everything needed changing. He was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the analytical intensity that had made him successful in both military intelligence and defense contracting. The Army's serious about reinstating you, he said finally. Full rank, full benefits, full authority. You could be running your own intelligence division within 6 months. I finally looked up from my phone. I'm not coming back for career advancement, Victor. I'm coming back because someone needs to fix the system that let this happen. And your family? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from an old battlefield. My family made their choice 18 months ago, I said. Tonight, I made mine. Outside the hotel windows, dawn was breaking over Westchester County. Somewhere across town, David and Melissa were probably dealing with the reality that their perfect wedding had become a national news story. Somewhere else, Patricia was likely crafting a statement that would minimize the damage to her reputation and her charity work. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about managing their comfort or protecting their version of reality. I was thinking about the soldiers who deserved accurate records, the families who deserved complete truth, and the system that needed someone willing to fight for both. Colonel Diana Hartwell was officially back from the dead, and she had work to do. 6 months later, I stood in the Pentagon's river entrance, watching autumn sunlight filter through bulletproof glass, while I waited for my first official briefing as Director of Military Family Affairs. The uniform felt different now. Not like armor I was hiding behind, but like skin I'd finally grown back into. The Clear Record Initiative had processed over 300 cases in its first quarter of operation. Families who'd been living with incomplete casualty reports. Veterans whose service records had been corrupted by administrative errors. Soldiers whose heroism had been buried under bureaucratic convenience. Each case was a small victory against the kind of institutional blindness that had nearly erased me. My phone buzzed with a text from Sergeant Maria Santos, now Lieutenant Santos, and my deputy director. Channel 7 wants an interview about the Richardson case. Should I schedule it? The Richardson case. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Richardson, supposedly killed in a drone strike 2 years ago, actually recovering in a classified medical facility in Germany after suffering severe traumatic brain injury. Her family had been told she died instantly, painlessly. They'd moved across the country to escape the memories, started a foundation in her honor, rebuilt their lives around her sacrifice. When we'd called to tell them Jennifer was alive, but would need extensive care, her mother had fainted on the phone. That was the weight of our work, not just correcting records, but dealing with the human cost of institutional failures. Every case we resolved created new trauma, even as it healed old wounds. Schedule it, I texted back. The Richardson family deserves to have their story told accurately. The briefing room was already full when I entered, a mixture of Pentagon officials, congressional liaisons, and family advocacy representatives. At the head of the table sat General Patricia Morrison, my former commanding officer, and now my direct supervisor. She'd been the one to push through my reinstatement, cutting through months of bureaucratic resistance with the kind of determined efficiency that had made her the youngest female 3-star general in Army history. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison began, Director Hartwell has the quarterly report on MFA operations. I moved to the presentation screen, clicking through slides that represented hundreds of hours of investigation, documentation, and careful reconstruction of truth. This quarter, we've resolved 47 cases of incomplete casualty notification, I began. 23 families have been reunited with service members previously listed as deceased. 15 veterans have had their service records corrected to reflect actual rather than assumed circumstances of injury or discharge. The numbers were clinical, but behind each statistic was a story like mine. Families who'd grieved unnecessarily. Veterans whose heroism had been rewritten as failure. Children who'd grown up believing their parents had died dishonorably. The financial impact has been significant, I continued. Insurance payouts, survivor benefits, and memorial expenses have cost the Department of Defense approximately $42 million in corrections and restitution. A murmur ran through the room. Military budgets could absorb $42 million, but the political cost of admitting systematic failures was harder to calculate. However, I said, letting my voice carry the authority I'd learned in combat zones, the human impact has been immeasurable. We've restored families, corrected historical records, and rebuilt trust in military institutions. General Morrison nodded approvingly. Questions? The questions came fast and pointed, mostly from congressional liaisons worried about media coverage and Pentagon officials concerned about legal liability. I answered each one with the measured precision I'd learned in briefing rooms exactly like this one, back when I'd been Colonel Hartwell instead of Director Hartwell. After the meeting, General Morrison asked me to stay behind. "Walk with me," she said, leading toward her office. "How are you holding up, Diana?" The question caught me off guard. In 6 months of working together, she'd never asked anything personal. "Fine, ma'am. The work is challenging but rewarding." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "I'm not asking as your commanding officer. I'm asking as someone who's watched you rebuild your entire life from scratch." I considered the question seriously. How was I holding up? 6 months ago, I'd been Sarah Martinez, invisible and forgotten, serving champagne to people who'd erased me from their memories. Now I was Director Diana Hartwell, testifying before Congress, appearing on news programs, rebuilding military protocols from the ground up. But the real question was more personal. How was I holding up as someone whose family had publicly mourned her death while privately celebrating her absence? Some days are harder than others, I admitted. It's easier to focus on the mission than on personal relationships. General Morrison studied my face with the kind of attention reserved for strategic assessments. "Have you spoken to them, your family?" The question I had been avoiding for 6 months. "David sent a letter through his lawyer 3 months ago," I said. "He wanted to discuss, quote, mutual confidentiality agreements regarding our family situation." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "And?" "I told him the truth doesn't sign non-disclosure agreements." That drew a small smile. "And your mother?" The harder question. Patricia had reached out twice. Once through an intermediary from the Gold Star Mothers Organization. Once through a family friend who'd served with my father. Both times, the message had been essentially the same. Couldn't we find a way to handle this privately for everyone's sake? "She's asked to meet," I said. "I haven't decided if that serves any purpose." "What would you want from a meeting like that?" I thought about it as we resumed walking toward her office. What would I want from Patricia Hartwell? An apology? An explanation? Some acknowledgement that she'd chosen comfort over truth, convenience over love? Or maybe just the answer to the question that had haunted me since that night at the country club. How do you bury a daughter who's still breathing? "I think I'd want to understand how she made peace with it," I said finally. How she justified grieving someone who was alive. General Morrison opened her office door and gestured for me to sit. The walls were covered with commendation photos, deployment maps, and the kind of military memorabilia that told the story of a distinguished career. "My brother died in Iraq," she said without preamble. "IED explosion, confirmed KIA, body recovered, funeral with full honors. 6 months later, I got a call saying there'd been a mistake in identification. The soldier we'd buried wasn't Michael. Michael was in a coma in Germany for months." The words hit me like cold water. "Ma'am, I had no idea." "We don't talk about it much," she continued. "The point is, I understand the complexity of resurrection. Michael survived, but he wasn't the same person we'd buried. Brain injury, permanent disability, complete personality change. In some ways, the brother we'd grieved was still dead." She paused, looking out the window toward the Potomac. "Your situation is different. You came back whole, competent, exactly who you'd always been. That's harder for families to process in some ways. It forces them to confront what your absence meant to them." "What do you mean?" "Your death gave them permission to rewrite history, to make you into whatever version of Diana served their narrative best. Your resurrection forces them to deal with the real person, not the myth they created." The insight cut deeper than I'd expected. For 18 months, my family had lived with Saint Diana, the tragic military daughter whose sacrifice had given meaning to their grief. They'd built charity work around her, social connections around her, an entire identity around being the family of a fallen hero. Living Diana was messier. She had opinions, accomplishments that overshadowed David's success, a story that complicated Patricia's narrative of graceful strength in the face of loss. "The question," General Morrison continued, "is whether you need their acceptance to move forward, or whether the work you're doing here is enough." I thought about the cases we'd resolved, The families we'd reunited, the soldiers whose service records now reflected their actual heroism instead of bureaucratic assumptions. I thought about Lieutenant Santos and the team of investigators we'd assembled, about the congressional testimony scheduled for next month, about the systematic changes we were implementing. 6 months ago, I'd been invisible, serving other people's celebrations while hiding my own identity. Now I was testifying before Congress, appearing on national television, rebuilding military protocols that would protect thousands of families from experiencing what mine had. The work was enough. More than enough. It was everything I'd trained for, everything I'd fought for, everything I'd survived to accomplish. I don't need their acceptance, I said, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. I never did. My phone buzzed with another message from Lieutenant Santos. Just got word that the Kowalski family wants to thank you personally. Their son is coming home next week. Another resurrection. Another family made whole by the simple act of telling the truth. I stood, straightening my uniform jacket. Thank you for the advice, ma'am. I should get back to work. General Morrison nodded. Diana? For what it's worth, I think your father would be proud of what you've built here. The words followed me back to my office, where case files waited for review and phone calls needed to be returned. Families who deserved truth. Soldiers who deserved recognition. A system that deserved leaders willing to fight for accuracy over convenience. 3 years ago, I'd been declared dead by mistake. 18 months ago, I'd chosen to stay that way rather than force my family to confront uncomfortable truths. But tonight, as I prepared testimony for tomorrow's congressional hearing on military casualty protocols, I realized I'd never been more alive. The woman who'd served champagne at her brother's wedding was gone. In her place stood someone who served justice, truth, and the kind of institutional change that honored every soldier who'd ever worn the uniform. My family could keep their version of Diana Hartwell, the convenient martyr whose death had given meaning to their lives. I'd keep the living version, the one who'd refused to stay buried, who'd chosen truth over comfort, who'd transformed personal resurrection into systematic change. Some ghosts, it turned out, were better at haunting than others. But the best ones learned to stop haunting altogether and started building something worth being alive for. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.